excellent. Slides.
No, you will do that. Hi, everyone. Let's get started. No, that's fine. That's fine. There's nobody here.
Hold on.
Okay. Perfect. Good. Okay. Let's quickly wave at the remote participants. They can all see us. That's excellent. Wave over there. So Roman, can you see us, Roman? Folks are perfect.
I can see you. It's not some kind of deep fake. Good.
Cool. Okay.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Great to see you in person, finally. Lots of familiar faces, some new faces too, which is great. And hopefully this is just a beginning of better days, hopefully, more face-to-face meetings. So welcome to the Oauth working group, and let's get going. This is not well, so if you're not familiar with this, especially for those new faces here, please make sure to get familiar with this. This governs everything that we do at the IETF, and it's important that you may know this stuff, right? So take your time and spend some time looking at this. Again, because this is our first time doing kind of a hybrid model type of conference, so if you are in person, make sure that you use a Meet Echo, and this is the on-site tool, please. So, you will use that to join the queue, even if you are in person here. You keep the audio and video obviously off. And for remote participants, again, you can make sure that audio and video are off unless you want to present or say something. And we highly encourage you to use a headset. So now we have a few sessions. So this our first session for this week. The other official session is on Thursday at the same time. We have also two side meetings. One on Tuesday, tomorrow at 2, and one on Wednesday at 6 p.m. Everyone is welcome to attend. Again, it's public meetings, so anyone can attend those too. A quick work group updates. First, RFC 9207 was published. Congratulations to Daniel and I think Kristen. I don't think he's here, right? Congratulations, guys. And thanks for everyone who contributed to that document and reviewed and provided feedback. So awesome work. Thank you. RFC edit queue, we have one JOT response for Oauth token introspection. I think we're just waiting for this to go through. We can't do much about this. Work group consensus, we have the first one is Christina's and Mike's document. Is a simple document. We progressed very well, very quickly. So we have consensus on this one, and we will make progress on this one soon. The security BCP has been languishing for a long time. You can blame the chairs for this. So we've started doing more work around this. So we did review it myself, and Hannes is in the process of doing it. He's halfway through this. Do you want to? Okay. We have to. Oh. So yeah, now I'm muffled. So Hannes is halfway through this document, but hopefully we'll make progress on this one soon. On the raw document, we kind of dropped the ball on this one, and we will pick it up soon. So we will start working on this one too. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, for doing an update of the document following the reviews that we did. So the next step is the Shepherd write-up, the IPR, I think. So if I correctly memorize it, for the raw document.
Yeah.
No? It was Thorsten. Yeah. You're right. Okay, not Daniel. Okay, that's fine. But it's the same status. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Thorsten. I don't know if he's online.
I didn't see him. Okay, so that's the update. Do we have any questions, any comments about this? Okay. So here is our agenda. Beside the chair's update, Brian will start. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
So all the last three, this is Mike Jones from Microsoft. All the last three documents are waiting Shepherd reviews?
Yes.
Okay.
So Brian will start with Depop. After that, I'll be talking about three-direction attacks, and Aaron will finish with Oauth 2.1. So that's for today. And for Thursday, we have device flow, and Peter will talk about this. Vittorio will talk about step-up authentication. Brian will be in supporting role, and Daniel will will be talking about libraries there on Thursday. So yeah, I have lots of interesting stuff to discuss. Any questions or comments, suggestions, personal attacks on the chairs? Okay, good. Brian. Okay. I wanna have, I don't know how to do that. Hold
I
on.
don't know how to do this either. Do you want to advance or?
I think you have to click. Just advance down.
Yeah. Like he wanted to control it from his.
I don't.
No.
Okay, then let's
Just have you do that.
yeah.
Okay.
Just let me know and progress it.
All right, ready to roll?
Yep.
All right, welcome. Nice to see everybody in person again. Here we go. This is weird. This is really weird. So bear with me. So Depop, OAuth 2 demonstrating proof of possession at the application layer. Doing a picture up here for IETF. This is on the other side of Austria though, so close, but not quite. Sorry?
Is your mic on?
It is.
Is it just, what if I speak a little louder? Okay, I will try to speak louder. All right, next slide, please. Man, this is awkward.
Yeah.
All right, little expectation setting here. I got 45 minutes, hopefully not going to use it all. Got a little jet lag, so again, bear with me. I'm going to do a full overview of the Depop protocol, trying to note particular places explicitly where changes have occurred recently. I know some of you have seen this before, so I apologize for any repetition, but I find it a lot easier to talk about things in context of the overall change, and then I'll wrap things up. Next slide, please. So Depop, the objectives of Depop, really quickly and in general, providing a pragmatic application level proof of possession mechanism for OAuth 2 access tokens and refresh tokens when they're issued to public clients. The pragmatic was a little bit qualified here. It is still pretty pragmatic, but it's maybe not as simple as it once was. And it's not terribly efficient because it uses public key cryptography on basically every request. But that is sort of the price of admission and where we've ended up with things. But I wanted to point that out and just head it off right at the beginning. Next. So it has been a while. Last time we were all together was IETF 106 in Singapore. A lot's happened since that time. We presented, I believe it was draft 3 of DFET individual draft. Sometime later, around the beginning of the following year, got a call for adoption, actually got it adopted. We've had several drafts since. Really, this was just an opportunity to say hello again to everyone in person and throw another photo up here of a nice IETF city. It's nice to be back. This is weird, but it's really nice to be back in front of everyone, see some faces inside and out the meetings. But since that time, give me the next slide, we've published a few things. So into the overview of Depop in general. Depop is this proof of possession mechanism. It's achieved by sending something we call a Depop proof JWT. It's sent as an HTTP header. What this does is it demonstrates a reasonable level of proof of possession in the context of the given HTTP request. This header is sent the same way with mostly the same syntax and semantics on both requests to the token endpoint at the authorization server and on protected resource requests. The AS uses it to bind tokens that it issues to the public key contained in the proof, and the RS uses the proof to verify bound tokens. Just an example at the bottom there, it's just a JOT, Depop header and a JOT, and fairly simple illustration of the token request includes the proof, bound tokens are issued. Following that, the bound tokens are used for resource access, sent in conjunction with the proof, and assuming that all validates, access is granted. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm nervous. This is strange. The general anatomy of a Depop proof, here's the JOT exploded. They're explicitly typed because that's one of the best practices these days, Depop plus JOT using that structured suffix syntax. The ALG, part of a normal JOT there, it only supports asymmetric signatures, part of just the way that it works because these keys are sort of established almost like on a trust on first use basis. You present the key and proof that you control the associated private key. So it only really works with asymmetric signatures. The actual key itself is included as the JWK header. And this is the key both the signature over this JOT will verify from, and that including the content of the JOT and the request is what proves possession of the associated private key. We've got a JTI just for a unique identifier for following replay. Some minimal information about the HTTP request. This is what binds it to the request. It's not an integrity mechanism over the whole request or anything like that. It's a minimal amount of HTTP information that just associates this proof with that particular request or a subset of information about that request. There's an IAT, an issued at time, and these proofs are then only accepted for a reasonable window around the IAT when receiving it. In draft 03, we introduced a hash of the access token that's included there only on protected resource access. In draft 04, we introduced the server provided nonce. So if the server challenges with the nonce, the client has to follow up by including the nonce in a claim in the proof. What did I miss? Something? I think we got it all there. Next slide, please. So an access token request, when actually requesting tokens, it's a normal request to the token endpoint at the authorization server, but a Depop proof header is included in the request, shown here in purple. It's just a JOT as a header. You'll see otherwise this is a normal authorization code request. Next, I don't know what to do with my hands. The access token response looks familiar. Access token is issued, normal stuff here, refresh token. But the response types indicates that this access token has been Depop bound by the inclusion of the Depop value in the header. For public clients that don't have credentials associated with this authorization server, the refresh token is also bound to the public key in the Depop proof. Next slide. Just following up with that, it looks the same. A refresh token request is the same kind of thing. A request to the token endpoint, normal refresh token stuff, but the Depop proof header is also included here. The result of this would be, since this is a public client, there's no other credentials, this refresh token was bound to that. So on checking this, the authorization server makes sure that the key in here matches the key to which this was bound, and then also subsequently issues new access tokens that are in turn bound to this request, or bound to the public key in this request. Next. And what an actual Depop bound access token looks like, either for JOT-based access tokens or tokens that are introspected, it's just the CNF claim. And in turn, that includes a SHA-256 hash of the JWK thumbprint of the public key that was in the proof. So basically, it's binding this token to that public key through a hash of the public key included in the token, using the CNF, the confirmation claim syntax, with a JKT for JSON Web Key Thumbprint, I think was what it was short for. Tried to keep it relatively compact. Next. On protected resource requests, no surprise here, they look really similar as a normal request. It includes the access token with Depop as the scheme, and also includes Depop proof in the header. And what this allows is this token then is bound to the public key in here, and part of the validation includes then validating the proof, signature accepted, and then in turn validating that the hash of the public key in the access token matches up to the hash matches up to the public key in the proof itself. That was a bad explanation, but I hope you get the idea. Next. So for protected resource access, we have a 401 with the www authenticate challenge to indicate that Depop is needed. In the case that there's a protected resource request without any token at all, again, it can respond with a 401, and Depop is the scheme. And here it can also indicate the algorithms it accepts for the proof itself. So these are the signature algorithms that are acceptable in the Depop proof, so the types of algorithms that it can sign. And for request, this is very similar to the bearer scheme, but a little bit additional information is necessary for like the signing algorithms. A response to a protected resource request with an invalid token for whatever reason. In this case, it was invalid because the confirmation didn't match the public key in the proof. So again, it's just a 401. The dub, oh.
There's something missing.
And that's how that got in the other spec. Copy paste. Anyway, there would be a Depop here, is the scheme, and then the normal error parameters, invalid token, and their description just saying withdrawn, as well as the alg can be specified here as well. And this is the algs in the challenge are the way that the resource server is able to signal what proof signing algorithms it accepts, so that it can be a little bit more dynamic with the client. Next slide. So in draft 4, we added the option for the server to provide a nonce the option for a server provided nonce to be included in the Depop proof, while drafts 5 and 6 hopefully refine and clarify this in a way that makes it really comprehensible and implementable. Some examples of how this works is the authorization server errors provides this error code, use Depop nonce, and the nonce itself is always included in a header of Depop nonce. So basically, this is just saying, try again and include this nonce in that element of the proof when you send it. It's a little bit different on a protected resource challenge because we have the www authenticate in play there. And in that case, it's the same error code, but delivered as a parameter on www authenticate. And the nonce, though, is again delivered in the header. So no matter where it is, the nonce comes back as a lone header. And that's useful, particularly in the case that you can provide a new nonce even for successful requests, which just tells the client on the next one, use this nonce. This allows a more efficient means of the server providing new nonces without constant back and forth. The challenges, that just looks like this. Whatever it is, it's an okay, but a new nonce is provided. And so in the subsequent request, the client would use that nonce in its proof rather than whatever the last one it had was.
So Brian, this is Roman. I'm sorry to kind of cut in from the Jabber. It's really helpful for you to point to the screen, but you're not by the microphone, so some folks are having a hard time to hear. So either reach over if you could, or pull the mic out so you can travel.
I was afraid you were going to say that because I realized what I was doing right as you started talking. Will do. Especially since we're almost done. Thanks for the tip. Next slide. Some metadata. The authorization server, so we talked a little bit about how the resource server can signal the proof algorithms that it supports. The authorization server can provide the algorithms it supports through the use of metadata. It's just one new metadata parameter, Depop, signing alg value supported. And this just signals support for Depop in general at the AS by its presence, as well as the particular algorithms that it supports. It's an array of strings. In drafts 5 and 6, we added client registration metadata. Both for client registration and for the general sort of model of client metadata is useful as a way of sort of providing a common data model for clients in general. We added Depop bound access tokens, and it's just a Boolean value that indicates whether this client will always use Depop or not when requesting tokens from the authorization server. This felt like a fairly common switch that might be needed to enforce particular policy around one client. So say this client is always going to use Depop. If it doesn't, something's wrong and reject it. Next slide, please. Thank you, Rafat. So binding an authorization code to a Depop key in draft 05, which is relatively recent, the optional Depop JKT authorization request parameter was added. This is a parameter on the authorization request. It's the SHA-256 JBUK thumbprint of the proof of possession key of the Depop key. This comes in the authorization request. The AS binds the authorization code it issues as a result of that request after the whole dance to that thumbprint. And then on code rejection, it checks that thumbprint against the Depop proof provided in the token request, otherwise rejects it. And this enables a more end-to-end binding of the whole authorization flow to a particular Depop key that was lacking in prior versions. It can be used in conjunction with PXE with no changes required to PXE. And when using PAR, you have that initial pushed authorization request. It provides the opportunity to bind early. So when you're using PAR, you can bind either from the Depop proof presented in the PAR request itself, the normal header, presented in the header or in the request, or can also bind using the same parameter, Depop JKT. If they're both provided, they need to be the same. Quick example of what that looks like, no scary surprise, but it's just an additional header in a GET request that would be sent through the browser. It includes the thumbprint of the key by that parameter name. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, next steps, IETF 114 is scheduled to be in Philadelphia. We'll see if that happens or not, but a couple of things that are kind of open right now that I'm aware of. One is whether or not the application Depop JKT media type registration is really necessary. This is the pattern that's been followed by a number of other documents. But as I look at it, it feels like a bit overkill to actually go out and register a whole new media type for this one type of JOT that's only ever going to be sent in an HTTP header. So there's some words in there that kind of ask that question. No one's actually answered them. Registering, it's not a big deal. We can put it in there, but it just seems really excessive. So I don't know if some higher ups, chairs or ADs have some advice along those lines. I would certainly be interested in hearing it. We also have 6 authors on the document, which according to the RFC Styled Guide is considered excessive. And Gritty's down here helping me with that statement. So those are 2 sort of administrative problems that I think need to be fixed for sure, but they are basically just minor administrative issues. So that in terms of the protocol definition and functionality itself, I feel like we're approaching a place where working group last call is a reasonable thing to start considering. So I'll put that out there. Are we closing in on working group last call? And yes, that is Philadelphia. And Gritty's from Philadelphia.
I thought Roman was trying to join the, Mike, if you can join the queue, please. Roman,
Yeah, I was
did
just
you?
jumping in to help with some of the administrative things.
Okay, go ahead, please.
So jumping in on the middle one is 6 authors excessive per the style guide. Yes, that is the letter of the law of the style guide. If the working group really feels that it's important to have all of those authors, I will support them in that. We just need to document that appropriately in the Shepherd write-up, and I will carry and support the working group in that decision through the IESG.
Oh, do you think that's possible, Roman? The style guide was very harsh about it, so I was assuming we would need to cut down. But if you think it's something we can push through with a little bit of explanation, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about this offline, but it's my understanding that all the authors there have very much kind of contributed there, and there's a very tight story as to why we have that list, and that seems important to the working group unless someone kind of disagrees with me. So I will help through the process to make sure that the document stays as it is with that author list.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mike, did you join the queue?
I did. You can see it on the yellow screen
Good,
there.
good,
It's a beautiful thing.
nice.
This is Mike Jones from Microsoft. My memory of the description of the JOT type claim is that those are intended to be media types with a special syntax addition that you're allowed to leave off application /. But per my earlier statement, those are supposed to be media types. Media types are things registered in the IANA media type registry. Therefore, I think we should just register it, even if it's never used as a media type per se. That field is for media types.
Your memory, I believe, is correct. I think that's right. It's just every time I sit down to do it, it seems kind of crazy, but maybe we should just go ahead. There's also a structured suffix for plus JWT registered, but I suppose that I wanted to think about that sort of as like a wild card for, you could just go ahead and use this as a media type, but it sounds like from what you're saying, we should just go ahead and bite the bullet and do the registration.
Right. The structured suffix was registered by a different RFC and is already in the IANA registries. And I couldn't remember whether we've done the registration or not. If we have not, I will create a pull request while we sit here if I get bored.
We have not done it. There's some rambling words to the effect of what I just said in the area
Okay.
where it would be, so
PR pending.
wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, Sohas?
Is my audio coming through?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Hi. On the registration, I would say we should go ahead and do it. On the working group last call, I would support to go to the last call. Within Cisco, we are planning to use this this solution for WebEx in order to mitigate theft risk for the tokens we use for internal services. And we've been following this draft pretty closely, and the refinements in the 5 and 6 and overall has been at the point where the returns are diminishing. I think this is good enough. We think we should go ahead with the last call for this draft.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
Put your hand down, Mike.
Yeah. Okay, so do you want to maybe then kind of update the document based on that discussion with Mike, and then we can probably start that with group last call?
Yeah, that
Okay.
sounds good.
Okay, awesome. Anything else? Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you all.
There you go.
Try not to break this.
Okay, I'm gonna take over. Good. Just let me know. You can choose this. Oh, okay. Yeah, you don't have to. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, let's get going. So I'm going to be talking about three-direction attacks. Next slide, please. So this, there was an article that prompted the whole discussion here. The article was talking about some specific vendors and issues around implementation of redirections. Just to be clear, those problems and issues that we will discuss right now, not specific for those vendors. It's just much, much wider than that. So next slide, please. So let's talk about how the whole thing starts with the attacker setup. Um, Initially, the attacker creates an account on the victim's platform, creates an application on that platform, and crafts an authorization request with the goal of redirecting that user to an application that controlled by the attacker, and then send that request to the victim through SMS or email or whatever. Right? Next slide, please.
Rifat,
Yeah.
also take the microphone and put it in there
Oh,
because
yeah,
you're doing
maybe.
the same.
Is that better? Can you hear me better?
That's good.
Okay. Okay, so this is a typical authorization request. You have the GET request with a response type, a redirect URI, a scope, and a client ID. And obviously, the host that hosts that endpoint. We're showing a host name that is shared between all tenants. Some other deployments will show the tenant itself also in the URL. The issues applicable to either deployment, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about what the RFC is talking about today, like how to handle those error cases. So the first part is talking about redirection URI. If there is a problem with redirection URI or a client identifier, then the authorization server should inform the resource owner and must not automatically redirect the user, right? Which is good. That's what we want, right? The second part is that it says if the resource owner denies that request, or if the request fails for any other reason, then the authorization server informs the client by adding some other parameters and redirecting the user, right? So that's the RFC today. And notice that it says authorization server informs the client. It doesn't say must, should. That's the way it is today. So next slide. So we will talk about 4 different issues that were discussed. Oh, actually, you can look at it here. The first one is if there is a problem with the request, there is an invalid response type or a scope. So after the user authenticates, and if there is one of those parameters are invalid, and the client ID and a redirect URIs are controlled by the attacker, then the user will be redirected to that specific website controlled by that attacker. So that's the first use case. Next, please. So the second one is after the user authenticates, typically you will get a consent. You'll have to either confirm or decline. So in this case, it doesn't matter what you do, whether you accept it or decline it, you'll still be redirected to that attacker-controlled application. Next slide, please. This issue is talking about even redirection even before the authentication. So this is an example of a crafted message. It's just the only thing that there is a client ID. Every other parameter is missing, and the user redirected automatically to a specific application. Next one. Okay, so this one is the most challenging issue probably that we'll face here. So this is around silent authentication, and this is an OIDC kind of specification which allows allow you to check if a user is still authenticated or the consent is still valid without really prompting the user, right? And again, in this case, the user will be redirected to that application controlled by the attacker. Next slide. So the question is, do we need a rethinking here around how to handle error handling, right? So do we want to say, hey, the server should always be responsible for handling those error cases? Should there be an explicit text about you have first to authenticate the user before attempting to redirect the user, how to handle silent authentication, which is probably the most challenging part of this story, how to handle the declined consent use case. Regardless of what we do, I think we at least want to document all of this and explain it, try to improve the current situation, and we could do that. And there are a few options here about documenting the status. Either update the current security BCP, which is trying to ship soon, but we'll see if that's the right path. If not, maybe a new dedicated document just to talk about those issues that we've seen in the field, right? So what I'm looking for here is that really thoughts, discussions, and see what should be done here. So that's my last slide, and looking for people to line up and have some discussion here. Any thoughts?
Go for it.
I didn't know if I should just like talk through Meet Echo, or since we're in the room, or what.
No. Yeah.
That was a joke. That was fine. Anyway, so everything you're describing here is kind of like, this is the known trade-off, the well-known trade-off of doing anything in the front channel.
Yep.
It's kind of an inherently phishable space, and the documents, especially the updated BCPs and stuff like that, do a pretty good job of describing that. Not going into exactly the specificity of these particular attacks, I agree. So to me, I realize that we're trying to ship as much as fast as we can, adding a few additional paragraphs to the BCP to describe the specifics of these attacks. To me, that makes the most sense. I don't think that this makes sense as its own document, just talking about one little description thing. If that's what you're going to do, you may as well write it in a blog post and call it a day, because more people would actually read it there. And I don't think that this really needs to hold up the BCP, because I don't think that this is really a new attack. This is really just a description of how bad this attack surface really is that we've all already know about, with just more specifics.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Mike.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Justin, I like your characterization of adding descriptions of things we already know. I think that is an appropriate kind of response to the thinking that the working group has done around this, and it's good thinking.
Yeah.
I do not think we should be proposing normative changes to any of our specifications. I think we should be, in particular, asking authorization server and OpenID provider implementers to think about the security implications of doing the redirect back under certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'd be glad to review such a text, and I bet Justin would too.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Daniel?
Yeah, I agree that this is probably, so the security BCP is probably the right place for this. Mm-hmm. But probably the next version of the security BCP. So I think at some point we agreed that we don't want to add any future attacks to the security BCP.
But we're not like, we're still reviewing the document. Like, why do you want to wait for a new version of BCP? Like,
because it usually entails a lot of discussion and probably delay in the already quite late document.
So I think, as Justin mentioned, like, these are well-known things, right? It's nothing really new. If we just capture this, just make sure implementers understand this. It's just waiting for a completely new BCP. It's.
I mean, if we can really quickly agree on a text to add, then it would probably be fine. But we shouldn't be waiting with the BCP for this change.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Anybody else? Any comments? Go ahead, Mike.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Speaking to Daniel's remark, we still have to go through IETF review. We
Yep.
still have to go through IASG review. There's a lot of opportunity to add a couple paragraphs. Prudently, I think those who care should find a room, write 2 paragraphs, and leave this week with mission accomplished.
Yeah. Well, we have those side meetings too, right? We can see if we can discuss those during that time, okay? Any other comments, questions? Okay. Thank you all. That was good feedback. Appreciate it. Okay. Aaron.
Apparently, I'm the shortest one here. Okay. Hi, Aaron Paraki from Okta. Slides there. I don't get a clicker, right?
No, yeah.
Okay.
Just look at this there.
Fantastic.
Whatever you.
So, thank you. I'm going to give an update on Oauth 2.1 and talk about some of the things that have changed since the last time we've talked about it, some of the plan changes, and then I've identified a couple of issues to discuss either here, since apparently we have quite a lot of time left, or during the side meetings for more faster paced discussion if needed. So since the last time we met, which was virtually in, I believe, October or November or so, we identified some things there and have done many of those updates. So thanks to several people who have contributed to the document to help make all that possible. The TLS is now mandatory for redirect URLs except for loopback interfaces. So that was a nice update to see. We've talked about that before. Hopefully not a surprise. There was a big reorg in the language used to talk about TLS because it was scattered through many different parts kept referencing that TLS was like a good idea and a new thing that maybe we should do. And so that's all now consolidated and it's kind of just assumed right at the beginning and then instead of repeated all the way throughout. There's been a lot more editorial clarifications based on Vittorio and Justin's extensive feedback, as well as some additional pull requests that were submitted by other people in the community, so that's wonderful. Another big reorg that happened is ongoing, it's not finished yet. We've been pulling out from the security considerations, it turns out there was a lot of things in there that was actually normative, and that's not really a good place for normative text, so we've been pulling that into the appropriate spot in the main document. And that counts both text from the security considerations of 6749 as well as other drafts that were extensions. So that's hopefully easier to see now as well. Another change was the refresh token guidance, so that now matches the security BCP, which had already updated its guidance previously. So we're trying to keep that in sync, and I guess that's going to go for the discussion we'll have this week as well about these redirection issues. So we'll have to roll that up too. I do think that it makes the most sense to essentially wait on the security BCP until that's more or less final, and anything that goes into that gets pulled into 2.1. And then there is a new section which is now in there, which explicitly mentions the implicit flow because there had previously been no reference to it at all. There's a new section in there talking specifically about it explicitly in relation to OpenID Connect. It is essentially saying that the implicit flow, the OAuth issuing tokens from the authorization endpoint is what is being removed from the spec rather than something called the implicit flow, and that leaves the room open for OpenID Connect to still define the response type ID token, which is a form of an implicit flow in OpenID Connect. So hopefully that is now clear for people who are wondering why is there no implicit flow. It's because specifically it's the OAuth one that we don't want. Next slide, please. So this is a lot of work. There's still more to do. And I have been going through Vittorio and Justin's feedback, have made it through about sections, partway through section 8 now. We're getting into 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13, so there's still a few more sections left. Some of that is started, some of that is still remaining. And that is, hopefully we'll get through that. There's still more normative text in the security considerations, which still needs to get pulled in line. Again, I've just been sort of doing that slowly as I've been going through the doc. There's the issue we identified at the last meeting, which is expanding the, there's a section in there called differences from OAuth 2. And as we discussed at the last session, we intend to be more explicit about the changes that are causing certain roles to do things differently and documenting exactly what is breaking for who. Since a lot of the later extensions do modify behavior of compared to 6749 by itself. There are a handful of open issues. That is the link to them, so please go there and read them. Essentially what I've been doing is, as I've been going through the reviews from, mainly from Justin and Vittorio, I have been making a lot of the suggested changes that are relatively straightforward and what I believe are not controversial at all. Mostly it's been editorial stuff. Anytime there's been something in there that is something that there is not a clear resolution to, I've been pulling it out as an issue so that we can actually track it better and make sure we get around to talking about it. So there are a handful of those in the GitHub right now, which we still need to process. Some of that can happen here in the room. Some of that can happen during the side sessions. Some of it is probably better for the mailing list, or the GitHub thread. So please feel free to jump in on those. Next slide. So for the, I guess I should pause, since what I have left for this is a couple of, I think it's 3 issues identified as things that would probably be a good issues to talk about in a larger setting synchronously now. But before I go and describe those and actually dig into this, do we have any comments or questions about the progress so far?
Hey, Aaron. Justin Richer. First off, great work. It is no small task pulling all of this text together and making it make sense. I just wanted to, if we could go back a slide, I just wanted to bring to light a very, very important point here on number 97 that might have been elided a little bit, and that's that the notion of what is backwards compatibility in the context of OAuth 2.1 is going to vary depending on whether you're talking about compatible for a client, for an AS, whether you've got a 2.0 client talking to a 2.0 AS or to a 2.1 AS or vice versa or something like that. And so I'm very, very glad that that is a focus. That is also something I'm going to, I wanted to point this out so that when people are reviewing this text, especially the bits that say, don't do this thing anymore, keep in mind what that means to all of the different parties in the ecosystem, because there are some types of breaking backwards compatibility that we're actually okay with, because certain combinations of those versions, we're okay with that actually not working anymore.
Okay. Then let's go ahead and move on to number 5. Yes. So at the last meeting, we had brought up this issue, which is this new mechanism, the ISS response parameter, that was a fledgling idea at the time, And the consensus at the time during the last session was, let's not touch it until it's reached RFC status because we're supposed to be rolling up best practices. Surprise, it is now an RFC as of like 3 days ago, I think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
congrats. So now we have to have the discussion again. So the idea with this is it is a security fix for clients that talk to multiple authorization servers. It is a pretty straightforward mechanism, which is, I believe, why it breezed right through the whole process and moved through pretty quickly. It only applies to clients that talk to multiple ASs. So if you are only talking to one AS, then you can pretty much ignore this draft completely and don't worry about it. So the question now is, now that it is an RFC, is it considered best practice? And if so, do we bring it into 2.1 or at the very least reference it from 2.1 as either a requirement or a possibility or et cetera, et cetera. There are now these questions to have. So that is the first issue. Any thoughts from the room?
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Out of fairness, I was one of the people who said, wait, it's now an RFC. I'm fine folding in guidance at least saying, if you're going to talk to multiple authorization servers, do yourself a favor and prevent the mix-up attack.
Great.
And I'd be glad to review text.
So along those lines, is it a better idea to incorporate the text of the RFC into 2.1 or in the appropriate place, reference out to it saying, here are some conditions, go read the mechanism over there?
As a sometimes editor, I'll say, include an example of using it in the normative text, but I'd be fine referencing it rather than pulling it all in. I realize there's a tension, but because you and the co-authors are correctly trying to create something that's more readable, and I've gotten some additional feedback that it is more readable. So, good for you and good for us. But it's a judgment call.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Anybody else?
Like, you don't care, Daniel?
I'm not in the queue because now I am.
There you go.
Okay.
You can't figure it out. Okay.
So, Daniel here from yes.com. Yeah, so I would also support what Mike said. So, including very brief guidance that you should do that, and maybe also the most common case, which is pretty easy, right? You add the issuer there. But in the RFC, we also have some guidance around what you do when you don't have this idea of an issuer in your OAuth deployment and so on. So there's a lot more guidance around some corner cases there, or like combination with JARM or something like that. So therefore, it would probably make sense to describe the common case and then refer to the RFC for the other cases.
Okay, I'm happy with that. For my own sake later, did that get captured in the notes?
Hold on. Brian has a comment.
Okay.
Yes.
I've actually sort of more of a question, Brian Campbell from Ping Identity. As you mentioned, it doesn't apply to most clients. They're just talking to one AS, but the actual mechanism of doing it is something the AS has to do. So I was maybe wondering if you could clarify or start thinking about how you portray that in a document like this, where you it's the optionality is sort of conditioned on something the client's doing, whereas the AS is the one that has to support it or not, or at least be on that side of it. How are you going to resolve that?
That is a very good point. It seems like probably the right way to handle it is to describe the situation as if your AS is likely to be used by clients that will support other ASs, then you need to do this. Because you're right, it is something that the AS has to build support for
in order for
a client to use it.
Okay.
But I also think that's actually pretty realistic, because I think realistically, or actually, sorry, there's another condition or another call out in the ISS draft, which is using separate redirect URIs per client. Is that correct? Or per AS? Client can use multiple redirect URIs per AS.
Yeah, but that's not a recommendation.
Not a recommendation, but it does solve the problem.
Well, that's.
And the mic.
Microphone.
Mike.
Yeah, Daniel here. If I remember correctly, we mentioned that this could be used in theory, but I'm not sure if we even discussed this in detail in the RFC. It's in the security BCP. There's an example. So there's more discussion on why you could use that to defend against mix-up attacks, but also why it's maybe not a good idea. So there's some subtle details there that you need to take care of.
Okay, sorry, that was...
So the ISS parameter is really the only thing that I would consider a robust defense against mix-up attacks.
Sure, sorry, it was a little bit of a tangent. I was just thinking, realistically, deployments are going to likely either, like, they tend to work as a whole. There tends to be an AS that someone is going to be using, and then a bunch of clients. So I think realistically, it's not really a problem in saying the sort of like, if your AS is likely to be one of many that a client works with in practice, then that's, I think it will cover it realistically.
Go ahead, Mike.
Mike again. Just thinking out loud, I would eventually get to this anyway. The ISS parameter was kind of motivated by the OpenID Connect issuer in the first place. And it's one of these cases, if you're doing pure OAuth and you're not doing Connect, all of this applies. If you're already doing Connect, you already have an issuer. And so the parameter would be duplicative. I'm not looking to make special cases, but I'm also not looking to add stuff that you already have.
Mike, can you repeat that? If you're doing pure OAuth and not OpenID Connect, what's the...
If you're doing pure OAuth, you don't have an issuer without this parameter. Whereas if what you're doing is always OpenID Connect and not pure OAuth, or OpenID Connect on top of OAuth 2, you always already have an issuer.
In the ID token.
In the ID token. So there's no need to also include it in the response.
I believe that's mentioned in the draft as well, right? Yeah, getting nods. Okay.
Could be.
Yeah.
I'm just talking out loud about where this is really needed and where it isn't.
This is all definitely making me think it's much better plan to mention some simple examples and reference out for the details, since the draft mentions all the details.
All good.
Yeah. Great.
Vittorio Bertocci, Okta. First time I say
First
Okta.
time.
I'm very excited. I seem to remember that part of the discussion was that you wanted to have an issuer in the request without having to dig inside the ID token. And there was some reason for that, because there are situations in which the ID token you might have to wait until you decrypt it. And instead, having the issuer in the request, even in the case of OpenID, was useful. Because then you were able, for example, to know what key you need to use for actually going inside the ID token. I don't remember the details, but I remember the part that there was specifically the desire to have these in the request without the ID token. Just wanted to modify what Mike said.
benefit. So you mentioned that in pure OAuth, there's no issuer, right? But I'm also, that's probably a separate topic, but I'm also strongly advocating for always having metadata in OAuth 2.1, which would mean that you would also have an issuer. So that might make things easier again, because you can rely on that issuer. So maybe some corner cases that are discussed in the RFC are not relevant. Just saying.
Got it. Yeah.
Philip Skokan, Okta. Echoing Vittorio's comment about asking to have the ISS in the response, one of the reasons to use that before relying on OpenID Connect is that it is actually available in the response. I don't have to make the code call to get my ID token, because even that code call, if I make it, it's part of the mix-up attack surface.
Yep. Okay, well, it sounds like, yeah, sounds like we more or less agree on that, so I will work on that and report back. So, yes, next. Okay, number 101 on GitHub. This is something I discovered as I was reading through the text I was copying and editing. Technically, RFC 6750 requires, but it's in the security considerations section, that access tokens must have a limited lifetime. That is not ambiguous. However, I know for a fact that many deployments do not expire access tokens for various reasons, which means they're technically not following OAuth 2.0 right now. So this is the reality today. And the question is, what do we do to reconcile that? Because it seems kind of weird to publish a new document that is going to even more clearly state that this is not allowed. Because essentially the reason I found this was I was going through the security considerations, pulling out normative text in line into the higher up in the docs so people actually read it. And this is one of those things, which I think people didn't read and then have just ignored because it was in security considerations. So maybe the question is, was this in security considerations because it was not intended to be a real must? Or was this always intended to be a real must and people have just ignored it, which means maybe we should just not enforce it because people ignored it anyway. So I don't know what to do here. Thoughts are welcome.
So as the primary editor of 6750, Mike Jones speaking, I'll say that I inherited a bunch of text from another Aaron, and I did with it what seemed best at the time, but I remember no intent to have a normative must even be in security considerations. In fact, stuff I've edited since that, I've tried to avoid ever doing that, but the IESG didn't call me out on it. So take that for what you will, but there's nothing conscious about this.
Justin Richer, to me, this really, like the paragraph is still decent advice, and it should be phrased as advice. If you have bearer tokens, which is what this whole section is about, then it's a good idea to not have them live forever. And that can be reasonably interpreted in a number of ways, including having a time-based expiration, but also, as you mentioned down at the bottom, lifetime doesn't need to necessarily mean that it's time-based. Like, you know, you can expire based on or you can be revoked based on an event, or on suspicion, or on client deregistration, or any number of other things. That's not clear from this text, and so I agree in expanding that. I don't think that this should have any normative weight at all, though, because this is security advice about, you know, this is a thing about bearer tokens, and one way to limit the attack surface is to limit the lifetime. And so I say get rid of this. Don't call it a must or a should or anything. This is just contextual advice for how to deal with some of the inherent problems of bearer tokens.
George.
Wow, will it work? You guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow, kind of fun. I guess the thing, you know, a little bit to Dustin's point that I'm sort of struggling with here is half of what we're trying to do in OAuth 2.1 is remove things that are security, you know, bad practice, right? I mean, otherwise we could say don't use implicit flow in the security considerations and leave it there. So if we think that allowing forever access tokens is a bad idea, then it seems relevant to me that we put some normative language around that in the text. I mean, as Justin pointed out, it does, you know, you could limit it to end uses or any number of other things. It doesn't have to be time-based, but I worry about just leaving it open and allowing, you know, bad practice to continue.
Go ahead, Justin.
Oh, Justin Richer. Just to Vittorio, I think you were in.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
whatever.
fine.
Fine. I was just going to say, if this does remain a normative requirement, I guarantee that I am not going to follow it. Because I have active. Mike says that I am a bad person. That's irrelevant to this part of the conversation. No, so I have a number of sort of, you know, larger system use cases where access tokens are taking the place of what we would have traditionally called API keys. Right? We're not issuing them in the same type of, you know, OAuth going to a client type of thing, but from the 6750 perspective, they are OAuth tokens, and they're being configured in software. And those get rotated when software gets redeployed or somebody just needs to, you know, rebump their configuration or something like that, but they're not being requested in the sort of dynamic fashion that we normally think of. We're okay with this because of the way that we have a very sort of very, very limited space in which these tokens get that get issued. They're not issued using 6749 tooling at all, right? And so that's a case where we looked at this and we actually decided to implement these quote unquote forever access tokens for use in this system because within our security model, it actually makes sense for that very, very limited case. So that's one of the reasons why, to me, this needs to be contextual advice and not a normative requirement. I absolutely understand where George is coming from. This should be giving all of the best advice, and that is good default advice. But you should be able to read and understand that and say, I'm pretty sure I know why this doesn't apply.
That's fair. I may also say that if you are not using any of the 6749 tooling to get the access token, then really it is an API key, not an OAuth bearer token, in which case, NA.
So I largely agree, Vittorio Octa. I largely agree with the spirit that has been expressed so far. I think that the intent there is good, but the way in which it's expressed is anachronistic and a bit simplistic. In today's world, in which it's fashionable to do continuous authentication, as long as you are on top of a reason for which you are still okay with that particular token, that token can technically live forever. Let's say that, again, I don't want to use fashionable stuff like zero trust and similar, but if you are using introspection, for example, or any other mechanism in which you can deal with revocation of tokens when circumstances allow or circumstances suggest that it's time to do it, as long as those circumstances never arise and you are still okay with the security posture of the caller, that stuff technically can live forever. I do agree with George that I think that, well, I don't know if we can have a normative text because of the nature of what I just described. It might be difficult to describe in formal terms what that means. But I do think that we need to help people understand that they do need to do the work, that they shouldn't just do a file and forget, here is the token, use it forever. It's more of make sure that you have sensible criteria to decide whether this thing should still be allowed to operate or if instead circumstances has changed. But I do agree that that sentence is just not applicable in a variety of scenarios like the one that Justin just mentioned.
It sounds like what you're saying is the AS must have a way to revoke a token if it wants to, under its own criteria.
That was one example of a token that lives forever, because somehow, like you don't know what maybe your user has done something that suggests that the circumstances are still, yeah, I'm still trusting this thing. But it's just one example, like the example that Justin brought up is different, but
Sure,
just as valid. So that's why I'm saying it's going to be difficult to find a normative language that will encompass all of this stuff.
Well, I was trying to find something normative that is also less specific to particular cases, so that like what you're asking for is don't hard code these keys such that they're just hard coded everywhere. Like make sure that you're building a way to revoke them, but the particular reason for revocation is not something we can normatively require, like say.
Or the mechanism that you use to perform that thing is kind of like, maybe we can enumerate a couple to give people ideas, but we can't enforce any. Like, for example, introspection is a good way of saying you must call home, or if you don't want to do introspection, but you want to have, I don't know, allow lists or block lists for the revoked tokens. Like, ultimately, I don't feel that we can be in a position of imposing to people what's best for their architecture. It's more of a matter of like, make sure that you don't paint yourself in a corner and give tokens that once out, they are out of your control and they can be used forever.
Seeing some nodding from George.
Okay, George?
Yeah, so I think I agree with that. My biggest concern is sort of what you stumbled across, Aaron, which is this is in the security considerations and probably nobody read it. So I'm hearing the difficulty of coming up with normative text to sort of imply the correct security behavior, but somehow I think we have to make it more clear in the default section of 2.1. Here are all these, here's some examples. Effectively, you need to protect the access tokens, as Vittorio just said, and here's some, different ways that you can do that, right? That isn't, just a reference to go read this section in the security considerations, so that we hopefully do a little bit better education, even if it's non-normative.
Okay. Peter?
Peter Castleman, Microsoft. So I don't have a particular problem with this idea that the lifetime of the token must be limited. I actually think it's good, because if you don't have the notion of an end state, you have no way to get there. So to Vittorio's point, by defining an end state, you have to define mechanisms to get there, right? So it's revocation mechanisms, it's events, it may be expiration times, right? There may be a number of those ways. You may want to consider giving guidance on what limited means, right? So that could be defined or enacted in a number of ways. But I think if you omit it, forever is an incredibly long time, right? And often doesn't last more than, say, a year or 5 years or something like that, right? So, so I think I actually don't have a problem with that statement. It's more about how you define limited and giving guidance to the implementers around how they construct policies, but having the ability to revoke in case something goes wrong. If you don't have that, you're going to find yourself in a really nasty place.
Okay, that's it right there. You good?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's enough on that. That is helpful. I will add that to my list and get back to report back on the mailing list, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I think we have one more. Yes. This was identified opened as an issue on GitHub, so this may be the first time people are aware of this. From the Native Apps BCP, which has now been pulled into OAuth 2.1, it actually has a requirement that authorization servers that support the Native Apps BCP all support all three of these redirect URI methods for native apps, which is private URI schemes. So that's claiming or defining your own URI scheme, and it gives some examples of ideally using like reverse DNS based ones, but that's not a requirement either. Claiming HTTPS URLs, which is a feature that iOS and Android platforms support, and also the loopback interface of just opening up a port on the device. And authorization servers must offer at least these three. And then it was pointed out that there are many times that for a particular deployment, you actually don't want to allow any one of these in particular for various reasons. For example, FAPI actually goes and prohibits private URI schemes because they're not nearly as secure as registered HTTPS URLs. So technically, if you follow FAPI, you also are not following the Native Apps BCP. So that is currently the way that it is written. So now that this gets brought into OAuth 2.1, it seems a little bit weird again to say that if you're following FAPI's rules, which are meant to be more secure, that you're then also not able to follow 2.1. So again, we have this sort of conflict that needs to get reconciled somehow.
Daniel?
Daniel@yes.com. I'm not sure if there's actually conflict there because it hinges on whether you want to support native apps at all. And I know a couple of deployments that intentionally don't support native apps. I think the same applies to FAPI. So one could say that if you want to support native apps, then you have to offer some of these options at least. But you can also just say not to support native apps.
But FAPI, native apps can also use FAPI. So
right. Yeah.
That's where the conflict happens.
Yes. So I'm not sure what the exact wording is in FAPI right now, but yeah. So probably it's a good idea to leave the door open for not supporting this.
Vittorio Octa. I know for sure that there are customers that want to get caught dead supporting the loopback interface. So having a must that includes the thing will automatically means that those people will be out of compliance. So I'm strongly in favor on not having a must in there. If we could get rid of a loopback, that would be fantastic, but I know it would be too good. So at the very least, I would not force people to implement it if they want to do a native client.
Brian?
I'm not sure what I was going to say now.
Get close to the mic.
I don't think it's not uncommon for profiles like FAPI or otherwise to further narrow what's allowed based on other things. I mean, for example, FAPI disallows client secret authentication, which is required by the base. So I don't know that there's inherently a contradiction. That said, though, I think the way that this text is being pulled from a BCP about a very narrow context and over, it would probably be better to somehow qualify it with not must or under the conditions that you're supporting native apps, you should do these things. Yeah, so it's both okay, and I think you should change it.
Great.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, Dave Tong, Money Hub. Yeah, and I kind of agree with what Brian's saying. I definitely think the wording needs to be changed. I mean, if I understand compliance, it's only if I fully support native apps, I need to offer all three. So maybe if I want to support not fully native apps, I could only support two. So I think it definitely needs, the wording is a bit strange. I think it's highly unlikely that any authorization servers many of them will just not be compliant with the security BCP, because I don't think that's the intention. Surely it must be that these are 3 different ways of doing it, which you could support. So yeah, that would just be my suggestion. And but also, if we're trying to make things more secure, unless there is a good reason to support the private URI scheme, then maybe that should be excluded, because the reason we excluded in FAPI was because of the fact that in many the mobile systems, different apps could claim the same private URI scheme. So I mean, the starting point I would say is to remove that unless there's a good reason to keep it in.
Yeah, that's another option, is to require claimed URL schemes and loopback, and make the private URI scheme optional. Just mention that it's a possibility, or just not require any of them. I'm kind of curious what the reason actually was for the requirement of offering all 3 of them in the first place, and I kind of suspect it was a optimistic attempt at interoperability, which kind of seems like maybe that wasn't the right goal for that feature.
George?
Yeah, so I think I'm in favor of not explicitly forcing authorization servers to support all these mechanisms. And I am in favor, sorry, I am in favor of ordering them by best security practices, right? So we should be telling people, use the claimed HTTPS URLs, right? And unless you have a really good reason to do something else, just don't, right? If you have to support some, legacy version of OS that maybe doesn't support it or whatever, well then, maybe you have to, right? And you have a really good reason for it. But otherwise, I think we should be pushing people toward the secure options, which at this point is, claimed HTTPS URLs. And, whether we want to put other, guidance in here around other ways, that the OSs are now supporting, to get app attestations, that's probably a different topic. But in this particular case, I would much prefer we sort of push people toward the secure solution.
Okay.
Any other comments? Okay.
So let's try to summarize this one. It sounds like we're going to, in the draft, reorder the list, claimed HTTPS URLs first, loopback second, private URL schemes third, just at least make sure they're ordered that way. And then just remove the sentence that says that the AS must support the 3, because nobody cares about that requirement, apparently, is what I'm hearing. And then maybe some fiddling about explaining why they're in a certain order or whatever, but I'm seeing some, just removing the must, essentially. Oh, claimed URL first, loopback second, private URI scheme at the bottom. Maybe even adding in some text about why you would want to support it at all, just to better set the context. Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Okay, good.
I believe that's the last slide.
No,
one more?
slide here.
Oh, just, okay. Yes, so those were the 3 that I wanted to talk about today. I felt like they were more complicated than a lot of the other ones and requires more joint thinking power. So there are, however, a lot more things to talk about. This is not done. And I would very much appreciate more of the discussion happening asynchronously on those. So the list I'm keeping track of is here. That is where anything that's open is still I'm going to close it at some point, one way or another, but before this is considered done. If you want to chat on GitHub, that makes it very easy for the editors to keep track of the discussion. I appreciate that. If you would rather discuss it on the mailing list, that's fine too. We'll pull it in. But yes, please. We would all appreciate some help with this. There's still quite a bit more to go.
So yeah, typically we want to have those discussions on the mailing list just for the records, right? And that's a IETF process. But yeah, you can send those also to the mailing list just so for people can go and take a look at the GitHub and see what's going on there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of post the state of the draft to the mailing list to let people know what's going on and call out some of those issues. I do feel like some of the issues are relatively minor, so I'm less concerned about the whole mailing list record for some of them. Obviously, some of them are a little bit more substantive.
Okay. Brian?
Sort of following along that, and I only sent an email this morning about it, but the idea of...
Closer to the mic.
Damn it, sorry. Yeah, only just followed up this morning, but back at the end of last year, there was a thread on the mailing list about the credentialed client type, and kind of nothing ever happened, and nothing was done in the latest draft about it, and so I wasn't sure if that was a forgotten about or a, I'm mostly just wondering if,
yes.
like, should I put an issue so it's followed? Or were you going to tell me to screw off? Did it just get forgotten?
Yeah.
How should I proceed in general, I guess?
No,
do we want to talk about it now?
I had completely forgotten about that issue. I guess my recollection of that thread was that there was some discussion and no real resolution to the mailing list thread either. So I think that's why it sort of died out, was it just got lost.
But adding an issue wouldn't hurt, right?
Yeah.
To avoid
if you
sort of like
limited
memory.
Definitely. It's so hard to go back through the mailing list and find all of the threads that are relevant to this draft. So yeah, if you want to file it as an issue, then it'll make sure that
it's tracked.
Okay. And then we can pick up the mailing list thread again too if you want to talk about it there. Or we can talk about it now because I think we still have time.
Yeah, we
actually have, like, if you guys...
You want to go ahead?
I mean,
no problem.
For what it's worth, my recollection is that the issue was more or less...
put it up on the screen.
Was more or less closed, so I was expecting some action, but that could bias me because that's what I wanted to happen. So it doesn't mean that it really was resolved that way, but
okay.
Yeah.
So
where would that issue be?
Brian sent an email yesterday, so check the archives and it should be pretty recent at the top, and hopefully it's in reply to the original one or not?
No, of course not.
Oh, okay. Why would you use a mailing list with all of its features?
But I think that I did link it so you could follow through.
So is it in the mailing list?
Yeah, it would be at the top of the mailing list. Just quickly to summarize, there had been some, I think, confusion about what the term credentialed client really meant. And then on further inspection, the actual normative requirements around it, outside of the section that it was defined, qualifies. Every single usage of it is confidential or credentialed client must do this. Confidential or credentialed client has to authenticate. So they are treated as synonymous throughout the document, just with more words. So the suggestion from me, and I think others sort of backed it up, was to get rid of the distinction entirely and provide some or any discussion around the various levels of trust and establishment and pre-registration and so forth in that, I forget what it is, 2.4 section. Describe the nature of it, but keep the two types as they are.
So, okay, I remember this thread now. Yeah.
Because we need to...
Are you gonna try to find it for the screen?
Because otherwise everyone is lost.
Oh, right.
No, he did a good summary of it though.
Yeah. I was ready
to me?
Yeah, now.
Expect nothing less. I think I'm done now.
Just the right one. IETF.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Share the screen. Hold on.
Oh, okay.
How do we
Reshare from.
maybe this one? Share
Yeah,
screen.
yeah.
Oh, you're gonna have to restart your browser for that one.
No kidding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's.
It's not gonna work, so.
Brian did a very good summary of the state of the issue anyway. That was a good recap of it. So the original text that's in there, every time you see the or credentialed in the new text, previously said confidential clients or clients with credentials, which I personally thought was more confusing because elsewhere it says confidential clients have credentials, otherwise a public client doesn't. So that was what it was trying to reconcile, was there is something between the two, because apparently we can have confidential clients or clients that have credentials that are not confidential clients. And that's already in the original draft. So that's what it was trying to do. So if I agree that maybe it could use some more clarification around the conditions under which a client may have credentials that are not, it's not a confidential client. That clearly needs to be explained better, because that is not obvious in either draft at the moment. But I don't think just reverting back is going to solve the actual problem.
Go ahead, Justin.
Justin Richer. So Brian's not entirely wrong. The term is definitely a bit confusing. That said, Aaron is 100% correct that we have more than just confidential client, which in the 6749 days was statically configured, hand registered, somebody called a sysadmin to go set up a config file somewhere type of client. And then public client, which was just, you get a client ID by calling the sysadmin and having them set that up without a client ID, and that's it. We don't live in that world anymore, and I think it is very, very important for OAuth 2.1 to not only acknowledge that, but also to embrace that. I personally kind of like the direction of credentialed client as sort of being situated in between. That said, I think we may want to approach this in a slightly different way. In that, if the definition of confidential client is simply a client that has a secret that it can keep, right? So a client secret or a key set or something like that, and public client does not. So it's a bit of an expansion and clarification of the original definitions without all the assumptions. Then there is an orthogonal dimension of how that confidential client, making sure I'm using the right terms, how that confidential client came into possession of its secrets and under what circumstances. That's what I think credentialed client was trying to capture, but by putting it on that same dimension, I think may have been a little confusing. So I think we might actually be able to have a better and more thorough discussion by sort of expanding the reach of what confidential client actually means, and making sure that when we are talking about confidential clients, if we mean one specific subcategory of that, then we name that subcategory. Because there are different security considerations that you have for statically pre-registered web servers versus a mobile app that gets a secret provisioned on install as part of, you know, an install framework versus something that does a full off-the-street dynamic registration versus the, whatever the, you know, Moderna ecosystem does and open banking and stuff with they reinvented CAs. Anyway, all of these are very different takes on how to get to that state, with the goal still being to get to the state where an individual instance of a piece of client software has access to a secret that can authenticate that instance of client software. And so, I think what we might be able to do is to back off in all of the places that say, you know, confidential or credentialed or whatever, just say confidential in all of those places. And then in our definition and discussion of what confidential means and how you get there, we expand that discussion significantly.
I like that for sure. One of the other implications of that is there are also many places that talk about considerations for confidential clients that would need to get qualified further.
Yes.
Because it would no longer apply to all confidential clients.
Yes, absolutely. And bike shedding, all of those categories is going to be a mess. I don't think there's any way around that. I think that having named categories is going to be very helpful for all of those. And credentialed client was a good stab at that, to help some of that differentiation.
Okay, I see where you're going with that for sure. I think that's doable.
Brian?
I think Justin proposed more or less the same thing that I was proposing, which is strange because I thought he was going to disagree with me. But I think the names are pretty bad, public and confidential, but we're sort of stuck with them. And I know personally I've used them in other documents that will still be applicable to 2.1. So unfortunately for what they are, I'd prefer them not to be changed. And then it comes down to just better explaining them. And I think that orthogonal access of trust that Justin described works and gives people the knowledge that they need. But it's not like you wouldn't authenticate a client with credentials just because of the way it was initially established. You're still going to check those credentials. You're still going to, so back to what I said before, it doesn't change sort of the functional places where you refer both of them and say they have to authenticate, but just a description of how sort of the provenance or the trust in the application or client comes to be as that orthogonal access of words that you'll come up with that are better than what I'm saying.
One of the other attributes is around whether or not the user gets prompted for consent. There's like an explicit mention that says public clients should always be prompted, even if it's like a first-party client. There's something around those lines. Or was the other way around of confidential clients might want to skip the consent phase. I don't remember which one it was now. But it's not just about the authentication of the client. It's about other implications of how much that client is essentially trusted by the AS based on various things, one of which is how that credential was established. So, but I think you're saying more or less
I think we're saying the same thing. And the areas I looked at were the credentialed, not for the other scope. So yeah, there's probably more touch points for clarity, but the same thing applies, I think. You know, a client that's registered through an open portal, is no different than a client that's registered via open dynamic client registration versus dynamic client registration that's done through some sort of bespoke access token issuance to get in there in the first place is more trusted maybe than
absolutely.
So there's
and that kind of touches on the redirect issue.
It does
earlier
actually.
as well.
It does. So yeah, I think I'm agreeing.
Yep. Okay.
Dave Tong, Money Hub. Yeah, I'm basically just to agree. We had a few issues and people asking, okay, what is this credential client, and trying to look through the current draft to see what you actually have to do differently. And there, apart from that initial, do you trust the identity? that seemed to be the only thing as far as I could see. So yeah, just very much agree. I think if we can keep it simple and then just call out this, I think Brian made a really good point. It's not all confidential clients are equal either in terms of how much trust there is, whether they're just registering. So yeah, very much agree with what's said before.
Great.
George?
I'll just add, I'm in agreement that the dynamic client registration spec 5791, no, sorry, 7591, I'm dyslexic this morning, basically implies that when you go through dynamic client registration, you have a confidential client. It uses the word confidential client in a few places based on the response. So, I think potentially, to Brian's point, keeping those words to represent those class of clients makes sense so that we don't introduce a new term. But all of the other points are super valid, right? Just because you have a confidential client doesn't mean that it's trusted. It just means that it can, accurately authenticate itself. And, the other things like, should you show consent or not, probably could apply even to some confidential clients if they're not trusted in the sense of an open, DCR kind of a model. So there's a lot of implications there.
Okay. David?
I just wanted to remark that it could be that it's better served by defining new terms.
Can you speak up, David? Can you speak up, please? Get closer to the mic, maybe.
I just wanted to say that it may be better to define new terms, possibly in axes of multiple.
We can barely hear you.
That's funny. I hear myself in feedback pretty loudly, actually.
Better? Keep going, David. Keep going.
I just wanted to say that it might be better to define new terms, possibly multiple terms to define different facets, because otherwise everywhere we use public and confidential, we're going to have to revisit those, such as binding registration, to make sure our reading of the older term breaking anything newer than them.
I didn't get that. David, can you send that in a message to them in the chat? Or did you get?
I think I got it. I was going to
Okay,
echo it.
go ahead, Brian.
And then argue against it at the same time. I believe that DW was saying that it would be better to introduce completely new terms because the existing terms are used throughout different documents and possibly multiple axes of terms to cover these things. I speak up now, maybe if I'm wrong about that, David. And I would flip it the other way because these terms are used throughout a number of documents that are not touched directly by OAuth 2.1, but will still be compatible with 2.1 and it's all of its framework. As bad as the names are, I think they should remain the same so that they don't introduce further breakage or confusion with those documents.
David, do you have any comment? Okay, don't see David and Mike again. Okay, Vittorio.
I am a bit concerned about post hoc redefining some of those terms. Although it would be handy to say anything that has a credential is confidential. In practical use, many systems are predicated on the idea that a confidential client is a singleton, and the infrastructure and the service and the programming model which is offered to the developers is based on that. And in fact, the confusion tied to that is also observable when people try to use such systems for IoT or similar, in which they try to distribute the credential to clients, but to a scale which wasn't designed for. So long story short, I think that if we decide to generalize the term of confidential client to anything that has a credential, with no regard with whether it's singleton or not, whether the assignment of this credential was done in a circumstance in which you would have some, how to say, extra insurance that you knew something about the registrar. Then I think that we needed to like convince ourselves that we will not break or that we will not create even further confusion and potentially contradict ourselves. Because like, although we never said, I believe, anywhere that this thing represents a singleton, originally this thing was websites, which were naturally, and then everything else was somewhat derived from that. So long story short, I guess I'm saying I'm a bit worried about making that sweeping generalization because of potential side effects. And given that I have a mic, I'll also say that to me it's odd that we might say excuse confidential clients from showing consent, but instead asking to public clients to do so, because public clients today, unless you use tricks like URLs, claimed URLs and similar, they're a travesty. Like you can use whatever client ID you want and pretend to be someone else. So asking for consent in that particular case in which you have very little confidence that the bits that are running are actually representing the thing that was registered as a client seems somewhat contradictory. But that was an aside. The TLDR is, let's be careful about generalizing what a confidential client is.
Brian?
I understand what was just said, but the generalization matches the reality of, I believe, what was written in 6749. Some of those cases you discussed are due to some of the prior weirdness of the various editors and taking over and so forth. I think it's pretty widely accepted that confidential clients are those with credentials regardless of how they've gotten them. And again, I've certainly written a number of documents that say that and rely specifically on that. So I don't think we're redefining anything. And provenance of trust and like the reason, right or wrong, the reason that lack of consent is allowed for confidential clients is because the picking up of the actual what's consented, the access tokens, is restricted to that client. Yes, the initial authorization request can be anything, but because they have to authenticate, because the callback only goes to a registered URL, that's why they're allowing for that part to be skipped, at least in the text, I believe is what it said. So it's not quite the right comparison, unless I'm missing something. Please.
Go ahead, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So on the whether it matches the reality, I'm not sure. Let's say that that's what we might have placed on the specs. But if you look at practical usage, for example, if you look at what some of the Twitter clients do when you install it on Windows, that's a public client, as in it has the same ID in every installation. But then in the moment in which you install this thing, you get a key. So you still have one entry, but and it behaves like a public client. It is a public client. It's a native thing running on the desktop, but you do get a key. So although we might not have, to say, formalized that particular flow, but that thing behaves just like the credentialed client that you attempted to place into that one. So I think it's a bit more nuanced than the reality is like that anything that has a credential is a confidential client in reality. In fact, like, I think there are a number of practical examples in which that is not the case. On the other one about the consent, I don't want to rat hole, so we can discuss offline.
I think what you just said was actually relevant to the thing that Justin mentioned, which is that the other factors of what the system is doing with this client is what's dependent on how that secret was obtained. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that it has a secret, and most of the things in the spec are things like, if you have a secret, use it, things like that. So who's left on the queue?
George.
George?
Go ahead.
Okay.
So I guess I don't want public clients, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what you were saying, Vittorio, but I don't want public client definition to mean a native app, right? Because if my client on the native app can basically create a public-private key pair where the private key isn't stored in the TPM of the device, right? And then it can use that for proving its identity when it makes calls. I don't think that should be considered a public client. In that context, right, it's something different. And I worry about labeling that as a public client. So if we're basically just saying public clients are, I always, for me, in going through this over the last bunch of years, right, I always looked at public clients as those clients that can't protect a secret. And a confidential client is a client that can protect a secret. So if the client can protect a secret, and when we were talking about dynamic client registration, you know, the expectation was the secret is instance specific, and therefore it can kind of protect it because it's the secret itself is not embedded in the binary. Someone to get it would have to jailbreak the device itself to get access to the instance specific piece. Then that would be considered a confidential client. So, you know, maybe the problem we have here is that we have a bunch of, you know, different interpretations of what these terms mean. And, you know, we're trying to sort that out, and it has ripple effects, as Brian's pointed out, against existing specs. But you know, that has been my interpretation. Confidential clients are ones that can successfully protect a secret. Public clients are ones who can't, regardless of where they're running.
Go ahead, Vitor. Great. So I think that this discussion is really an excellent example of clearly we have different points of view and different interpretation of how this thing went. Because for me, being very pragmatic and having to deal from the developer side, the main difference is that there is only one Twitter website, but there are millions of Twitter installations. Like everyone on the phone have their own instance. And then whenever Twitter decides that they want to identify a particular instance or not, it's up to them. So I can model the Twitter client using a public client. And then if I want some extra guarantee, I can find a way of also assigning a key so that although I still have the same client ID, and the client ID is the thing that deals with the nature of a client, I have those extra guarantees in which I can recognize the instance. Now, I can't claim that this is normative because this stuff is not covered. All I'm saying is this is the way in which I've been operating and helping customers model things or observing others modeling their own system. To me, this just points to the fact that if we go in the direction of saying, no, now we formally want to say that anything that has a credential is a confidential client, then we needed to be explicit and saying, okay, if you were doing the thing that I just described, in which you have those enhanced public clients, in which you can recognize the instances of a client, but they all have the same client ID, you needed to distinguish these from singletons, in which when you have a website, then it's just one. And so let's use it in a different way. Let's call it confidential client plus plus, or max, or 365, depending on the company. But like, yeah, credential client, perfect. So just wanted to clarify.
Active confidential.
Active client? No, Mike. The Microsoft jokes in this room. Justin Richer once again. I think Victoria, sorry, you were saying all lunch about how everybody gets your name wrong, and I've known you for years. I think Vittorio and I actually do agree violently in different directions. So everything that he just described about how you have this special class of public client that's not acting like a public client, I would call that a confidential client that's not acting like a statically registered confidential client. And that's why I really think we do need this different dimension in order to talk about these things. I'm with George and with the language that we have in dynamic registration that said once you get the credential, then you are a confidential client. Like that was one of the selling points of dynamic registration was take your public client and turn it into a confidential client in a way that Oauth could actually think about it being a confidential client. With all the security caveats that this is not the same as a statically registered one. And then with software statements and registration jots and all of that other stuff, people have bootstrapped a lot of other layers of trust on top of that as well to have even more gradients here of trust. However, at the end of the day, it is presenting a credential of some type, be it a client secret or something else. Now, I do think that it is interesting if you vary the client ID per instance or not, and what that actually means. That should be part of this discussion. That should, however, not be part, I would argue, of the definition of what makes a public or confidential client, right? Because if I decide to give everybody the same client ID, everybody in the world the exact same client ID, and differentiate them based on their keys instead, I could write that system. It's kind of a dumb idea in OAuth world because so much is leveraged on the client ID, that public identifier. Was that? Yeah, that's what Twitter did. That's what a bunch of other things out there have done. And Google did that back in the OAuth 1 days as well with their weird XAuth extension thing, whatever that was called. Regardless, the point being that I don't think that this should be wrapped around the client identifier at all. I do think that it does make sense to collapse down to these two categories if we can then have this larger discussion about how you got into that category.
That is really what I'm hearing, is that there's a lot of factors about clients that you want to treat differently depending on a lot of different things, none of which have to do with whether or not it has a secret.
Yes, exactly.
And it applies to both clients with and without a secret. All those factors apply to both clients. So I don't know. Right. It seems like there's two different issues going on. One, I agree. Let's simplify the terms. And then two, there's a lot of stuff we need to talk about. Like there's more things to add about these different considerations, and everything that I've heard is definitely like a good thing to bring in as a, hey, if you have this situation, and I think some of that exists in the current draft, but it was more tied to the public or confidential type, which, as we've seen, is not actually the correct place to tie it.
Right.
So,
yeah, we should be making distinctions when there actually is a difference between things. And in a lot of the discussion that I've noticed here today, a lot of the decisions being made are actually decisions that are on top of the OAuth protocol and not within the OAuth protocol itself. Back to Aaron's point of any time that it shows up in the text, it's basically saying if you have credentials, present them and verify them. And then what you do from that point is a different question that you answer with different information.
So Vittorio's concern was ripple effects of redefining the term, and I think that's something that's worth paying attention to, but I don't necessarily think it's a deal breaker. I don't think it's something that we should stop and revert this plan. So proceed with caution, and I'm happy to keep that in mind as we work on these changes.
Okay, we have 2 minutes here, and I want to allow George to get into the mic. George?
Sure, I'll be real quick. I think, Vittorio, your model is a really interesting one, and actually surprisingly one I've heard. Right? When I think about dynamic client registration, I always think about issuing each instance of a client its own client ID, and specifically that's so that I can block that particular client instance separated. Now you could do that by the key as well, right? So I would like, I guess for me the question is where do we have these larger conversations about models? Because I think it's super important, right? We probably have some best practices or some patterns for the way things are implemented. And, does that go into a spec? Do we pull that out into something else? But I think that would be really helpful for developers to understand that there are multiple models and the pros and cons of doing, things one way or another.
Okay. You want to wrap up?
That's it. I'm happy with this discussion.
Okay.
Thank you. It was very productive. I've got my homework cut out for me.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Good. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks.
Yeah, great discussion. Thank you all. we are done for today, but we still have 3 more sessions. So 2 side meetings, and we have Thursday also as an official meeting. Okay, see you there. Go ahead, Mike. Last minute.
Mike Jones, are the side meetings on the list? Or if not, could you do that?
I sent it to the list. I think I will send it to the list. Yeah, yeah, that's fine. Okay, thank you all. Yes, will do. Good to see you, man. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
As long as it doesn't say confidential, do not share.
You're good, you're good. It's just, you're good.
Man, I felt like my. You look
Yeah,
at this, look at
man, you did amazing. Can we mute this thing? Oh, no, that's awesome. Thank you. We should ask all the time, but yeah.
No, but you know, like it's, if you don't know the people and
Yeah.
one dies fast.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Okay, good. Great discussion.
Absolutely. It's like
I've known you for ages.
Great topics too.
too many video calls.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually.
So when did you
Alright, I'll let you go.
tired? I'm really tired.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Peter. How are you? Just upgrade to.
Ich hätte nicht volontieren sollen, ein Meeting zu machen.